Students are always a little bit surprised on the first day of class when I tell them at the opening of representing the Holocaust that I don't remember the Holocaust directly. Because I was born in 1951, all I know of the Holocaust, all I understand of it, is what has been passed down to me by the victims in their diaries, by the survivors in their memoirs, by the historians in their chronicles and histories, by the novelists in their fiction. What I know has been passed down to me by friends and survivors and long nighttime conversations, video testimonies, dozens of which, even hundreds of which I guess I've now seen at Yale, and other video archives. And increasingly, my memory of the Holocaust is dependent on the national institutions and memorials conceived and shaped precisely to deepen the public's memory of the Holocaust. But I found, just as I did in the literature, that just as literary forms, different kinds of literary forms like memoirs, diaries, fiction, all shape the Holocaust in different ways, memorials and national institutions like museums also shape the Holocaust in very different ways. In fact, the study was born when, toward the end of the research on my first book, Writing and Rewriting the Holocaust, I realized that the rooms in which I sat at archives at Yad Vashem or at Devo in New York or at the Jewish Museum in Prague or at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw or the archives at Auschwitz, in each one of these places I found a very different Holocaust. And in some of these places I found no Holocaust as I understood it at all. And with that in mind, I decided then to expand my inquiry to include the spaces in which I sat, literally the physical spaces, the memorial spaces in which I did my research. And I found that every nation remembered the Holocaust very differently, each nation remembering according to its own ideals, its own political agenda, ideologies, its own experiences. And I found that even within nations, different communities remembered very much depending on who was doing the commissioning of the memorial, which kinds of artists were being invited to submit proposals for memorials. It depended very much, the shape of Holocaust memory would depend very much on the kinds of training an artist went through. As you'll see here in some of these slides, Nathan Rappaport, the creator of the Warsaw Ghetto Monument in Warsaw, was trained in very much a Beaux-Arts tradition. He was somebody who also built monuments, busts for Soviet war heroes during World War II. And as a result, anything he makes for the Holocaust is going to reflect very much his own preoccupations. Because he was both a socialist and a Jew. In fact, a Jew insofar as he understood himself to be a socialist, a member of Hashomer Hatzair, the kind of labor Zionist left-wing young guard movement. His own Jewish identity was refracted through a political identity, so that it was impossible for him to separate these two identities when he came to making memorials like you'll see at the Warsaw Ghetto, the grounds or the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto. The memorials work on several different levels, I found over time, including the kind of the economics of the period, who brought them into being, under what circumstances, what kinds of specific experiences they wanted to remember. That is, did they want to remember heroism, or did they want to remember massacre? Did they want to remember political victimization? Did they want to remember Jewish victims? Did they want to remember all of these things in a religious way, which would confer a certain kind of religious or theological meaning on events? And as you'll see, when we get to a video I made on the Day of Remembrance, a Yom HaShoah veHaGvura, the Day of Remembrance in Israel, even the days of remembrance are constructed in very particular ways, to remember the Holocaust in very particular ways. As you'll see, this day, today is April 19th, in fact, the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which on the Hebrew calendar took place on Nisan 15, which is actually Passover, or it was actually the Erev Passover in 1943. And the fighters wanted to designate that day, therefore, on the Gregorian calendar, April 19th, as the day to remember the Holocaust. But the rabbis in Israel resisted this because they said, well, you mean you're going to take away the one really happy day we have? Pesach is really the greatest of Jewish holidays in some ways, the holiday of freedom. And so the state agreed and said, but we also want to pull these events, the Holocaust, out of your religious continuum. And the rabbi said, but we already have fast days that remember catastrophes like this. We've got the 9th of Av, we've got the 17th of Tammuz, we've got the 10th of Tevet. Can't we make the Holocaust Remembrance Day one of these days? And the state said no, and when the rabbis asked why, the state replied by asking them what kind of meaning is made on these days. And they said, well, the same kind of meaning we've always made. And they, what kind of meaning is that? Well, these days commemorate destructions of or aspects of the destructions of the first and second temples. And the reasons, the strict, or ultra-Orthodox reasons for the destruction are, according to the tradition, mipnei chatainu, because of our sins. And by locating a Holocaust Remembrance Day on one of these fast days, the state feared, rightly, that we would now assign the same kind of meaning to the Holocaust. In effect, we would end up blaming the Jews in Europe for their own massacre. And precisely because the state wanted to create a brand new set of meanings, they located on a very different day, now located on the 27th day of Nisan, a day which falls about midway between the end of Passover week and Israeli Independence Day, creating a narrative in its own right, a narrative which generates first the remembrance of deliverance at God's hands from Egypt, and then remembering Holocaust and heroism, and then remembering Israel's fallen soldiers, all of which is redeemed now in the birth of the state. So it's in a very traditional redemptory kind of dialectic. Destruction and redemption this is kind of a paradigm which is repeated over and over again in Jewish history and subsequently then in European Christian history as well, picked up as one of those paradigms they picked up from Jewish tradition. With all these things in mind, I wanted to look at why and how these memorials were created, who was coming to them, and I wanted to recognize our place in their midst. That is, without visitors, these memorials remain essentially amnesiac, inert, inanimate. They depend very much on the kinds of memory we bring to them, what we take away from them when we leave, and finally, I believe, how we respond to the current world in light of the memory passed down to us by these memorials. In fact, at the end of my book, I say that I'm not so sure that without responding to current catastrophes, current ongoing persecutions in light of the Holocaust, we may not have remembered at all, that the Memory Act remains incomplete until we respond to stop contemporary persecutions and suffering whenever and wherever we can. These were all the dimensions of Holocaust memorialization, which I look at in the book. And on this little kind of memory tour, I'll take you through memorials first in Poland and Germany. At the Israeli section, probably, depending on time, I have slides here also on Israel and America, but I think I may stop and we can talk a little bit about the way the Holocaust is remembered in America, in fact. But I may stop with the video, which I did, which is a real-time video of the 2-minute siren on the 27th day of Nisan in Israel, and to allow that in a way to finish this talk. Many of the reasons against building monuments you'll see in Germany, emblematizing in some ways the German dilemma. Every nation has this dilemma. When the Holocaust is remembered in America, it's remembered largely in terms of American limited participation in the liberation of the camps. And so is remembered often in terms of liberty, egalitarianism, justice, or in opposing terms, but always in the American idealizations of itself. So a Holocaust memorial like we might see here at Liberty State Park in New Jersey is within sight of the Statue of Liberty on the one hand and Ellis Island on the other, creating a triad of American ideals, basically. Liberation, liberty, immigration, and pluralism, all there, emblematized now by using the Holocaust. In Germany, they have a special problem there. Nationally, it's double-edged. How do they remember events that they might rather forget, on the one hand, and how do they rebuild a new and just nation on the bedrock memory of their crimes? These things just are not easy questions to solve. And so a new generation of German artists has answered by building memorials which challenge their own coming into being, what I've called counter-monuments or anti-monuments, which we'll examine here. In Israel, as I mentioned, the Holocaust is usually always remembered, almost always remembered, with reference to heroism. So the Day of Remembrance in Israel is called Yom HaShoah veHagvura, Day of Holocaust and Heroism. These things are always twinned, both to reflect the experiences of the fighters, many of whom ended up in Israel, and many of whom sat in the early Knesset, conceiving of an early Holocaust Remembrance Day. And also, it is a way to generate images of the new Jew, in Israel. And the state was established, in fact, as a bulwark against just these kinds of catastrophes in the future. In Poland, the Holocaust is remembered often, what we call a Holocaust, and I refer, when I say this, to Shoah, or the calculated mass murder of nearly 6 million Jews, murdered solely for having been born Jews. But at the same time, we know that in the concentration camps, millions of others died, suffered, were killed, died of disease. And so in Poland, in fact, Jews are remembered right alongside political prisoners. And in Stalinist Poland, really up through the 50s, Jewish identity was submerged altogether into the identity of political victims. And I'll tell you the story of the very first memorial in Auschwitz, which shows this very displacement of Jewish victimization by political victims. And this isn't always to blame the Poles directly. I mean, there is a memory contest there, as we know. Nearly 6 million Poles were killed or died during World War II. Half of them, or about 3.2 million of them, were Jews, murdered solely for having been born Jews. But the others died in both military operations, concentration camps, bombings, mass shootings. And so that often when the Holocaust, or when the Poles remember their own national catastrophe, they will remember it in the image of the murdered Jews. And so we'll look at the ways that these images get used back and forth and reciprocally. Well, with these kinds of issues in mind, I think I'll turn to the slides and begin walking you through from the sites of destruction onward. At the sites of destruction, this being Auschwitz I, the material remains of the camps often invite visitors to mistake these remains for the actual events themselves. And this is something that I keep in mind because, in fact, nothing is so overwhelming as visiting these sites. They're gigantic. They're much bigger than the imagination ever might have conceived. This gate with the Arbeit macht frei over it, again, might emblematize many visitors' experiences there. As you see, barbed wire, the guard towers still stand. I'm on the International Auschwitz Council, and we are charged with trying to redefine memory now for the future with the change in government. Tadeusz Mazowiecki, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Poland after the communist regime, appointed us to retell the Holocaust now, to remember it in a new, current way. They also wonder what to do with the camp. Do they let it rot? Do they restore it? Do they conserve it? And I've suggested, in fact, that you don't let it rot. I think you want to preserve maybe one or two of everything there on the one hand, but on the other hand, you also don't want to conserve everything and to invite people to think that what they're seeing here is what actually existed then. I think we want the grass growing up around the remains to show that, in fact, some 50 years have now passed between the liberation of the camps, or in this case, the demolition of the camps, and our present moment. We need memorials that show us both the passing of time as well as what happened there. This is the bombed remains of one of the crematorium gas chamber complexes at Auschwitz, Birkenau. We ask ourselves, what does it remember? Does it remember the guilt of the Germans who tried to destroy it just before leaving and evacuating Birkenau? Or does it remember the fact that these things actually existed? It remembers both, in fact. It also remembers the great time that has now passed between then and now. The very first Holocaust memorial competition was chaired by Henry Moore, the British sculptor, who, along with the jury, received some 426 submissions from around the world for a Holocaust memorial to be placed at the end of the tracks at Birkenau. This was the winning collaboration. Henry Moore wrote at the end of the competition that it would have taken a Michelangelo or a Rodin, perhaps, to come up with a fitting memorial. We didn't have a Michelangelo or Rodin, even though the very greatest sculptors and architects of the time applied in 1958 with their submissions. So the jury invited the 3 winning teams, finalist teams, to collaborate on this, which is relatively understated, a series of forms, abstract, kind of semi-cubist forms, which in their different sizes would suggest men, women, and children, perhaps. At least this is probably what the Polish authorities saw in 1967 when they went to unveil it. Because then when they unveiled it, they in fact decided that this would suggest Jewish victims, because the only people murdered in the camps, men, women, and children, were Jews. They took those figures and put them down below, and then they replaced them with a marble slab up on top with a triangle in it denoting political prisoners. This was right at the height also of Poland's own anti-Semitic purges in 1966, 1967, right in the time of the Six-Day War, in fact. This memorial was unveiled just about 2 weeks before June 6th, 1967, was the outbreak of the Six-Day War. On each of these tablets at that time was inscribed that 4 million people suffered and died here at the hands of the Nazi murderers between 1940 and 1945. But we know, in fact, and historians have long known, that the actual number is closer to around 1.3 or 1.4 million, which isn't to take away at all what happened here, but is to ask then, why the 4 million number? And we've always known, historians have always known, that around 1.3 million Jews were murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau. With the 4 million number now, you can take that 1.3 million and subtract from it and come up with around 2.7 million non-Jews supposedly murdered here at Auschwitz-Birkenau, political prisoners. This was a number that was inflated, in fact, to generate a large number of political prisoners who were not murdered here, even though they suffered and died terribly at places like Auschwitz. In fact, the very first victims of the gas chambers at Auschwitz were Russian POWs. The Germans experimented on them just to make sure they worked well. What this slide is a picture of the tablets effaced. One of the first things we did was to, at Auschwitz, was after 1989, was to change the inscription. We had to take them off, and literally the inscriptions awaited new memory afterwards, between 1989 and this last year. Now, for the first time, we have inscribed on them between these years, some 1.4 million people died at Auschwitz-Birkenau, 90% of them Jews. This is to suggest the ways that, in fact, official memory changes with the change in regime, and we need to keep this in mind. At Majdanek, one of the other death camps in Poland, just outside Lublin, the sculptor Victor Tolkien, a Polish Catholic sculptor, won the competition in 1969 and won it with a form which he wanted to suggest great danger, a memory as a kind of an ominous and dangerous act. He wanted, when people stood under it, to feel threatened by the burden of memory, which you do very much. As you look through here, you can still see the gas chamber crematorium complex standing with Lublin nearby. In fact, it was so effective as a very dangerous form that the government, when they unveiled it, put a chain link fence around it to keep people from standing underneath. And Tolkien said, the whole point is that I want them to stand underneath and feel threatened, so they took the fence down. It's safe enough, but as you see, there is this sense of being closed in by memory, and he wanted people to remember painfully and in a threatened way. The artifacts at places like Auschwitz-Birkenau and at Majdanek here serve several functions. On the one hand, they want to suggest the sheer number of people lost and murdered at places like Auschwitz and Majdanek. Increasingly, museums go over and they take back the shoes and the clothes in order to show them. And I have some qualms, in fact. I understand why you want to show these artifacts, and they're very persuasive again in their rhetoric. I mean, they really suggest the material remnants of victims. They show the victims by their absence, technically. But I worry that maybe the remnants also reduce the lives of victims lost only to these remnants. In a funny way, by remembering the victims only in their artifacts, we remember them as the Germans would pass them down to us now. It's very difficult to reassemble the 1,000 years of Jewish history and civilization in Europe in these artifacts alone. So I can understand mixing artifacts, with stories like this, but for years these shoes stood for, in the words of the Maidanic Museum, the economic plunder. They proved the economic plunder at the heart of the Nazi murder machine. Basically, Nazism was, for the communist era authorities, monopoly capitalism run amok, and that they were death factories, swallowing up the victims basically in order to produce things, even though we know that the camps rarely produced anything more than they swallowed up. When people ask, well, of all the memorials, which would you call the greatest? I say, well, it's hard to judge, but perhaps the most overwhelming is the memorial at Treblinka, a death camp in the northeast corner of Poland, about 3.5 hours from Warsaw, where some 850,000 Jews were murdered in about a 2-year period. Just before the Germans evacuated Treblinka in 1944, they destroyed the barracks, the gas chamber crematorium complexes. They covered over the pits and they planted it all over in grain fields, so there was nary a sign of it left. People and local villagers who wandered into this area, though, would often find themselves knee-deep or even thigh-deep in this funny, terrible, muddy jumble of bones and blood, and so they knew very well what had happened here. In 1964, Poland commissioned two artists, one an architect and one an artist, both Polish Catholics, to design what they call the greatest of all genocidal cemeteries. And here they've installed 17,000 granite shards in a huge area you see surrounding this obelisk, suggesting both the brokenness, suggesting a cemetery on the one hand, but broken tombstones or matsevot on the other. And on several hundred of these stones is inscribed the names of Jewish shtetlik, or villages, throughout Poland and the East. The obelisk in the center, about 26 feet high, has inscribed in front of it, "Never Again," in several languages, including Polish, Russian, Yiddish, and German, and French. And even it, as you see, is cleaved from top to bottom, suggesting the brokenness in memory, suggesting that even the forms of memory do not actually mend or recuperate memory here. And the only individual remembered here is Janusz Korczak, the head of the Jewish orphanage, a Polish Jew whom the Poles remember very affectionately, and as a Pole, and whom Jews remember very affectionately as a Jew. So he ends up being the only member. He is one who went with his charges at the orphanage to Treblinka and died with him there, rather than being released, even though the Germans gave him an offer, gave him a choice. And again, when the tourists come to places like Treblinka, a whole other kind of memory, is being enacted here. These stones depend on us for memory. This is a group of both survivors and others who have come back, not of survivors of Treblinka, where almost nobody survived, but survivors of other camps who came on one of these pilgrimages to Treblinka in order to remember. Increasingly, in fact, I'll discuss the ways that part of my resistance to tours based solely on Holocaust remembrance is the ways that they might reduce the memory of what actually 1,000 years of Jewish life only to its moment of destruction, thereby, in fact, generating a sense of Jewish identity built only on memory of the Holocaust. And this is something that we'll tend to resist later on. Other memorials in Poland are composed of broken tombstones, because, in fact, when the Jewish survivors, some 250,000 Polish Jewish survivors, returned to their hometowns after the war, they found that the villages had been destroyed, their Jewish communities had been destroyed, and they went out to the cemeteries to mourn their lost brethren and found that even the cemeteries had been destroyed by the Germans. The Germans had gone out to Jewish cemeteries, broken the tombstones into pieces, ground them into dust to make concrete with them, or often just lifted them up wholesale and then paved roads with them. Before they could mourn their lost brethren, they had to build places of memory. So this is one of some 20 different pyramids built in different Jewish cemeteries in Poland, this one at Sandomierz, by the survivors when they came back. There are no survivors left here now. There are no Jews left in this village of what had been about a village of 40%, with 40% Jews. In Kazimierz na Doni, another village not too far from Lublin, not the Kazimierz of Krakow, the local town also built a memorial to the victims, to the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and also used the Jewish tombstones. These tombstones have been pulled up by the Germans and then used to pave a road going to the Franciscan monastery, which had been converted to Gestapo headquarters during the war. Polish tradesmen who had been forced to pull these up and lay them down were now volunteered to take them back up and to build this wall designed by a Polish architect, Tadeusz Augustynek. But once again, you see the broken tombstones are very emblematic on the one hand of the destruction of the community, but even the attempt to put them back together into memorial is almost always a result in a breach of sorts, and so that many of these memorials use brokenness as a theme. In fact, recalling Jewish funerary motifs of brokenness. You might recall that one of the mourning motifs is in Jewish tradition is the torn lapel. On the tombstones, many of the Polish Jewish tombstones, you see broken candlesticks, broken trees, broken bridges, all to suggest a life interrupted by death. And these kinds of images of brokenness are picked up now by Polish artists and architects building Jewish monuments. So that's already a funny kind of breakthrough. How is the destroyed people remembered? By their very emblems in cases when they don't even exist anymore. Thus, in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery, again, volunteers made a retaining wall of the tombstones. The epitaphs on the tombstones, which used to recall and briefly the lives of those being commemorated here, even these epitaphs as narrative are broken into bits and pieces. The letters themselves broken, sentences broken, letters broken, flying in all directions here. At Płaszów, just outside Krakow, in fact, the site of Schindler's factory and the concentration camp where these Schindler's Jews stayed. This memorial was erected partly actually by some of Schindler's Jews and by other prisoners at Płaszów. Again, 6 figures, 5 figures in fact here, broken into about lapel length with a kind of breach in memory again. And the Warsaw Ghetto monument, designed by Nathan Rappaport, was actually designed, in his words, to be a very Jewish monument. But when he submitted it to the Moscow authorities, he designed this in Novosibirsk, where he had been given refuge by the Soviets during the war, and where he had been commissioned to make Soviet war hero busts. When he heard of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, as a Warsaw Jew, he wanted to commemorate it somehow, so he proposed this memorial for the Moscow authorities, something they could put up in Moscow. Well, they rejected it, calling it too nationalistic, that is, too Jewish, and said but we'd like to keep the maquette anyway, and so they did. At the end of the war, Rappaport came back to Poland and made another maquette, and I want to show you just the original version. See, has a menorah at each corner. The stones are very rough hewn, recalling perhaps the Kotel or the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and these were all deliberate acts. In 1948, actually on April 19th, 1948, 5 years to the day on the Gregorian calendar from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the Polish authorities unveiled the Warsaw Ghetto monument, and they had only a bed of ruins on which to do it. This is actually the site of the actual uprising, but the Germans at the end of the uprising, the longest uprising in Europe during the war, lasting some 6 to 8 weeks, went and bombed and basically torched every single building, leaving only about 5 meters of rubble standing. The memorial at that point in 1948 seemed to draw its very strength from the rubble in which it stood. Over the years, it has become a little bit more domesticated. But the figures you see here are very classical. They're almost Promethean in some way. You've got a prophet figure down on the left here picking up a rock. You've got kind of a reference here to what had been called the pathetic hero of World War I statuary. That is, after World War I, sculptors and monument makers began making monuments which seemed to mourn victims more than celebrate the triumphs of the victors. And then Mordechai Anilevich marching forth here as much a worker holding this grenade in his hand as if he were holding a hammer. A young youth with a young guy with a knife on the left here, a woman on the right holding a Kalashnikov rifle, a Kalashnikov which hadn't been invented until 1947, but which had been Rappaport's model, and then a Liberté figure almost quoted directly from Delacroix's Liberté. All of this reflecting both Rappaport's training as a Beaux-Arts artist in many ways in Paris, and also his own notion as a proletariat, as a socialist. The baby, too, is holding its arms up. Everybody in this image is rising up to protect themselves, rising up to resist. A complete departure from the very traditional images of Jews going to their destruction. This bas-relief is on the back side of the Warsaw Ghetto monument. 12 figures, perhaps representing the 12 tribes of Israel, in very classical exilic motif here. This is actually a quote directly from Shmuel Hirschenberg's painting of 1904 called Golis. Basically, it's exile. It's going into the galut. These people on their way, in fact, to the camps. Depending on who remembers here, something different is remembered. When Willy Brandt came here in 1971, I think it was, 1970, he came in a conciliatory gesture. He knelt at the bottom of the monument, and the Germans were concerned, as you see down here, with the Spiegel kind of question of the week: should Brandt have kneeled? Should he have kneeled at the foot of a statue or a monument commemorating resistance to the Germans? I mean, this was an issue here. How do you commemorate? I mean, what role does a German have in commemorating those who rose up against them? When Jimmy Carter visited the monument in 1977, he did so partly, I think, to quell the fears of a Jewish community in America worried about his peace talks, which he was just getting off the ground at Camp David between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. He came here both to remember fallen Jews and to remember heroic Jews, perhaps, those in his mind and in his phrases who would be working and striving toward peace. But you see that every move has a political dimension, and there's no denying it. Public art lends itself to this always. Solidarity in Poland never had its own monument. They never had a monument to the Polish uprising of August 1944. The Soviets disallowed a Polish uprising or monument to the 1944 uprising because they feared that such a monument would instigate a new Polish uprising now against the Soviets, and they were perfectly right. After Solidarity met here at the monument, they marched. They began a march that 6 weeks later culminated in riots at Gdansk and the Danzig shipyards. They used the Jewish figure, that is, as an inspiration for their own uprising. Pope John Paul has visited the monument, and what does he remember? Does he remember his own role as a fighter in the Polish underground, or does he remember the Jews who died rising up against the Nazis? Or does he remember that the Poles in Warsaw witnessed? There's not a lot they could have done, but they witnessed on that Easter Sunday the beginning of the uprising. Remember that the 1943 Easter and Pesach also coincided, as it did this year. In Germany, the memorials are everywhere. The landscape of German memory is a very full one. Dan Diener, an Israeli historian, has suggested that the unwritten constitution of Germany is in fact the Holocaust, that every historical move, any political move now in Germany has to reference itself to the Holocaust, either overtly or covertly, before going on. This is at the Wittenbergplatz subway station in Berlin, just a sign saying places of terror that we should never forget. That's all. I mean, just simply, in no discernible order, a list of concentration camps. At Dachau, the very first German concentration camp, built in March 1933, just only 2 months after Hitler came to power, a young child of actually two victims of the Holocaust, Yugoslav Jews, murdered at Auschwitz, Nandor Glid, built or designed this sculpture, which went then at Dachau. But Dachau also has its own history in the German minds. It is, in fact, a splendid museum. It's a very good memorial. It's visited, by really hundreds of thousands of people every year. On the one hand, but on the other hand, people rarely remember what transpired at Dachau between 1945 and 1960 when the memorial was built. Just shortly after, between 1945 and 1947 or so, the Americans held some of their war crimes trials here, where they tried the SS and ended up jailing many of them in the prison at Dachau, and also hanging many of them here. After the war crimes trials, the Americans set up a great food processing plant at Dachau, which supplied all of the American Army occupation forces with their food, quite literally. They also ended up interning AWOL American GIs there at Dachau. So Dachau went from an internment place of German political prisoners to a place where many of the straggling Jews from the east were sent and where they died toward the very end of the war, to a place where SS officers were tried and executed, to a place where Americans were then jailed for going AWOL from occupation forces. Shortly after that, it was turned into a DP center for all the Germans displaced from the Sudetenland who came and had no place to live. They took over the barracks between 1950 and about 1957. And finally, it was turned into a great kind of weed-strewn, overgrown place that winos and others took over for about 3 years. When the Dachau Survivors Association came back and visited the place in 1959, they were horrified by what they found, and they appealed to the Germans to create a memorial there, which the local community then did. But they had to tear down all the barracks. They built these, or only symbolic foundations, where there had been barracks. And you can see here in the background, it's a very sterile, almost antiseptic place. It's abstract in many ways, only suggesting what was. The museum gives you particulars. But there were 3 memorials built at Dachau. On the far left is a Protestant memorial, in the center a Catholic memorial, on the far right a Jewish memorial. Everything is organized very well here. The crematorium is open from 9 to 5, you see. And as you go into the crematorium gas chamber complex, a gas chamber which was never actually used to kill people, but would have been had the war lasted longer, perhaps, the image of the ovens is now repeated in the image of the Jewish memorial. And this was designed, in fact, by a Jewish survivor of Dachau, but it also brings to mind the ways that the Holocaust is often remembered in Europe, not as the destruction of 1,000 years of life, but only as the moment of death. And so in this case, as in many others in Europe, the Holocaust is primarily remembered in that last moment of destruction. And as you see here, we won't go back, but this picks up an image of the crematorium complex, and as you look up the chimney flue, there's even a little menorah at the top, like a wisp of smoke. At Buchenwald, really the second major concentration camp built in Germany, also later on in '33, when they began construction there, the East Germans took it over really as a site of what they called self-liberation, showing that in fact the underground in Buchenwald, which had in fact risen up against the Nazis about 4 hours before the Americans came, providing a model, in effect, for the East German government, calling East Germany in some ways a self-liberated state, distinguishing it from West Germany, which they saw as an extension of fascist Germany, of Nazi Germany. The rising up here would suggest rising up both at Buchenwald at the time and also rising up now against the capitalist West, if you will. It was a place where East German army officers literally were awarded their stripes, a place where their figurative forebears in the Communist Party had won their stripes during the war, you might say. This is a triumphal monument, not a monument to the suffering so much as to the victory over the Nazis. Now, the German problem with Holocaust memory includes the monument itself. Many young German artists see the monuments as an essentially fascist form of art. It's a big thing telling you what to think. It's hard, it's cold, it's unyielding. It's a monument. Monuments traditionally were used, in fact, by the Nazis very well. They exploited all kinds of monumental architecture, monumental sculpture, and everywhere they could. So that when young Germans are commissioned to build memorials to this time, they have increasingly turned to forms which challenge the idea of the monument. They feel that monuments, in fact, might displace as much memory as they emplace. They feel that monuments often provide people with an excuse to go to the monument to leave their memories there, turn around and leave them behind. What they wanted to do instead was to return the burden of memory to visitors to their memorial. So in Harburg, a little suburb of Hamburg, just over the river, Jochen and Esther Gertz designed a disappearing memorial, a column 12 meters high, covered in soft lead, which invited visitors to come and add their names to ours, the artists, so that as more and more names cover this 12-meter tall lead column, it will gradually be lowered into the ground. One day it will have disappeared completely, and the site of the Harburg Monument Against Fascism will be empty. In the end, it is only we ourselves who can rise up against injustice. Quite literally, they wanted to return the burden of memory to people who came. They wanted people to participate in this kind of memory. And participate they did. A local burgher comes and writes his name. At the beginning, the artist names and the people who participated in the early unveiling have inscribed their names in neat little rows. Jochen and Esther Gertz had conceived of this almost as a very traditional war memorial in which there would be lines and rows of names. But before long, it was covered in a great kind of scribble-scrabble of graffiti, all kinds of things, even as you see a swastika, which was fairly common, throughout this. And when the town protested that, this might have been kind of an interesting idea, but what we have here now is a trap for graffiti and filth, the artists replied that, don't monuments everywhere just reflect back to the community your own preoccupations? And if this is what it reflects back to you, then so be it. This is the German remembrance, then that's what you have to live with. And the local newspaper, in fact, called this monument a fingerprint of the German conscience. They say this reflects back to us exactly what we're thinking. Over time, with every 1.5 meter section covered in signatures or this graffiti, there was a sinking. So the newspapers came out and the TV, mass media all came out. And the artists always came, and the mayor would, very solemnly, rededicate the monument, if you will, by sinking it into the ground. And of course, this act embodied for the Gertzes the German dilemma perfectly. How do you remember an event you'd rather not remember? Get rid of the monument. They saw this basically as a German process, a way of burying their monument. So they would sit along the side and really laugh somewhat mischievously at the sight of Germans celebrating the disappearance of their anti-fascist monuments. Over time, in fact, it did disappear. It got shorter and shorter until it was actually a year ago last November when it was finally buried altogether. Another Gertz monument, which I won't go into here, this is the monument of this is the Plaza of the Invisible Monument, in which Gertz's students were asked to carve the names of every cemetery, Jewish cemetery in Germany destroyed. They took these cobblestones back to the plaza from which they'd taken them and then buried them, but buried them inscribed side down. And then when they announced it, the town came out to look for the monument, and the Gertzes said, "You are the monument. You must do the memory work. We have done this to invite you down here, and now you must come and remember for yourselves." Let me, this is another one of the counter monuments. Why don't I come up now to the Day of Remembrance, in fact. These are all images from Germany. And we'll come to Israel, and I'll finish with this short real-time film of the Day of Remembrance, which I described to you a few minutes ago. On every 27th day of Nisan in Israel at 8 a.m., this siren sounds for 2 minutes. And I want to ask you here exactly what gets remembered here. You will literally see the many faces of memory. Soldiers shifting uncomfortably, the survivors there thinking of their lost families. And this is the kind of thing that we need to keep in mind when we think the multiplicity of memory in a moment like this. The context in which this day comes. And remember that the day is surrounded on all sides by other meaningful days. So I remember the last couple of years in Israel on this day, that the siren itself had taken on a new meaning after the Persian Gulf War. That long siren in Israel is the all-clear signal, also to come out of bomb shelters. So you could see the look of relief on some of the young Israelis' faces for whom the siren had now taken on an additional meaning. The siren is also sounded on the day of remembrance for Israel's fallen soldiers in a way that would thus link, perhaps, memory of Israel's fallen soldiers in Israel's wars with the victims of the Holocaust as well. In fact, we know that the victims of the Holocaust are accorded honorary citizenship in Israel by Yad Vashem, by order of the authority. It's with all these things in mind that I would invite you, in fact, to think hard about the different ways that Holocaust memory is organized in both the days of remembrance, your books, your own texts, and the sites you visit. So thank you very much for your attention.